Spectrobe Origins is not only my favorite Spectrobes game, it was also the first one I ever played. But back when I played it, I had no idea at all that certain Spectrobes from the first two games just weren't there. I'd always assumed that, being the third game and everything, it would naturally have all the creatures from the first two games, plus new ones, that we hadn't seen before. But I was wrong. And in today's episode of Mind's Eye Perspective, I'm going to tackle my thoughts and theories as to why I believe that certain Spectrobes just didn't make the cut.
Play. Television is the red, the mind eye, mind eye, mind eye. Play. Television is the retina, the mind's eye, mind's eye, mind's eye, mind's eye. Television is the red, the mind's eye.
So, the first reason I'd like to address as to why I think certain Spectrobes just didn't make it into Origins is changes to the gameplay from the other two games. Now, Spectrobes as a series seems to like to reinvent the wheel of its combat system every time a new game comes out. Well, all two of them. 2 new games, there's 3 games in total. Whatever. Anyways, this can, however, create problems when certain Spectrobes are made with certain battle systems in mind. For example, while you could get every Spectrobe from the first game into Beyond the Portals, some of them just felt like mere shells of their former selves. Could that Spectrobe heal its allies in the previous game? Can't anymore. Could its attacks home in on specific enemies and target them? Not this time. Nope. Can it surround itself in a barrier where anything that touches it gets hurt and its teammates can punch things into it, creating a sense of teamwork? Gone. So perhaps they didn't want this sort of thing to happen in Spectrobes Origins, or they just couldn't figure out a way to make some of the old Spectrobes work too well with the new system. Although the new battle system isn't that far removed from Beyond the Portals battle system, so that one's kind of up in the air. But then again, this is only my first point because I think it's the weakest. The next reason I think that they have certain Spectrobes not appear in Origins is because with Origins, they began to have more consistency between evolutions. In Spectrobes and Spectrobes Beyond the Portals, there were melee Spectrobes that could evolve into ranged attack Spectrobes, and sometimes you would have range attack Spectrobes that would evolve into melee Spectrobes. Now, this presented itself with an interesting dynamic where you might think to yourself, maybe I want to keep it in its adult form and not evolve it into its evolved form and what have you, or vice versa. But in Origins, they just decided if it's a melee Spectrobe, it's pretty much always a melee Spectrobe, save for like 1 or 2 exceptions. But Origins does kind of give you the whole, do I want to evolve it right now or not, with the addition of abilities. When an adult Spectrobe is a certain level, they gain certain abilities that could make them just about as useful as an evolved Spectrobe. And evolving it right away, while it would grant it better stats, would mean that you would lose those abilities until it leveled up further. But it might be worth keeping it at its lower form, and still have an ability that might make it more useful than a higher form with no ability. Speaking of abilities, this also might be a reason why certain Spectrobes just didn't reappear. Unlike Pokemon, Spectrobes doesn't seem to be very keen with giving the same ability out to multiple Spectrobes all over and over and over again. And so, in this sense, they might just not have been able to come up with abilities for certain old Spectrobes. I mean, it might be easy for us now, after the fact, to think of things, but when you're on a time crunch and a deadline, and you've got so many other factors and details to work out, it taxes your brain, and you do eventually fatigue and just run out of ideas. I mean, again, look at Pokemon. I'm not talking about the Pokemon designs, people. I just mean, like, how many old Pokemon were slapped with the same abilities that other Pokemon already had, rather than coming up with something new back in the day. So, I guess that's something they wanted to avoid. Another thing to keep in mind with Spectrobes Origins is that they changed the Spectrobes properties, which, for those who are more familiar with Pokemon, properties in Spectrobes are basically like types in Pokemon. In the old games, you had Corona, Aurora, and Flash as your three main properties, but in Origins, they decided to go, well, the more Pokemon route and have them based on elements. Fire, water, sky, etc., etc. And I think for some of these Spectrobes, they just weren't able to figure out how to translate what they are into these new properties. Some might make sense as plant, but then there's others that it's like, maybe they're sky because they use electricity, since all Spectrobes that use electricity in Origins are considered sky property. But then it's like, well, their previous form didn't use electricity, it just hit things with its arms as dual-wielding shields or whatever. And that kind of harkens back to the consistency between evolutions point that I brought up earlier. So, I guess for some of these guys, they were just like, shit, I don't know what to do. And lastly, perhaps they just had issues with modeling and animating some of the old Spectrobes. Considering that the Wii is a good deal more powerful than the DS that they had been using, perhaps they just, I don't know, couldn't model them and animate them properly according to what they had in mind. I have to admit, this is probably the weakest reason of the bunch, but I just thought I'd include it anyways because it was the only other thing I could possibly think of. Well, that's all I've got. What do you guys think? Do you think there's any good reasons why old Spectrobes were left out other than just cutting corners and time crunch measures, or do you think that they were lazy? I don't know, drop me a comment, and see you in the next video. Bye.